In this video, I'm going to give you 4 tips from my personal experience quitting marijuana. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel, like the video if you haven't already, and comment for the sake of the algorithm. Now let's get started. First of all, the reason I'm making this video is because it's been frequently requested on my channel. I know that many people who have never had addiction issues may scoff at the idea of being addicted to marijuana. But in reality, whether it's an addiction or some kind of habit or dependency, a lot of people seem to fall into this trap, and I have been one of them. So I'm going to talk to you about my personal experience with marijuana before I tell you some specific tips from my experience quitting marijuana that may help you quitting marijuana that are a little bit different than the tips I would give for other drugs. Though I don't mention it frequently on my channel, I have a lot of experience consuming marijuana, unfortunately. Well, I don't know how unfortunate it is really, but there were two-year periods in my life where I consumed marijuana daily. And throughout most of that time period, I consumed marijuana from the time I woke up until the time I slept. Consuming, like when I used to smoke marijuana, it was between 3 and 7 grams a day. Mostly sativas, and I was quite fond particularly of the haze variety. I used to live in Europe, and in Europe and in Amsterdam there's a clone called Amnesia Haze. That was my favorite strain. It's a very psychedelic, potent cannabis without much of a body high. Now, how did I get into consuming marijuana in the first place? Well, I was for most of my life a teetotaler until I faced a period of crisis in my early 20s where I was very depressed and anxious. And for a period of years, I had been hanging out with my friends, close friends, who drank and smoked marijuana and did other things, and I didn't. I would go out with them to bars and not drink and all this kind of stuff. And in the end, that time period where I was depressed, I tried marijuana with a friend. And I was shocked to discover, when I tried it, that all my depression, my anxiety, my worries just disappeared. I felt completely in control of my happiness. And this ability, this power to control my happiness just overwhelmed me. And the thing is, even though I had not consumed drugs much, I grew up in the 90s when there was enormous media propaganda about cannabis. I mean, it was not just on TV and in movies showing cannabis as a harmless drug that was very funny and unjustly criminalized, but also I was a fan of, for example, rap music when I was a juvenile. And rap music, for example, you guys can think of Snoop Dogg and Wiz Khalifa. These people propagate this idea that you can consume marijuana all day and, for example, be a top performing singer, travel around the world, get all your business done, and marijuana is something that you could just consume all the time. So I had this idea that marijuana was sort of harmless. It's never killed anybody. There seem to be people who consume it all day and they do fine. And so this led me, when I started using it, to think on my own that I could consume marijuana all day. Not only did it remove my fears and my concerns about the world, and it does this, by the way, by controlling your GABAergic system, but also it made me a nicer person, to be honest with you. It made me more empathetic, and I liked the way it made me. So I was happy with it, and I continued to consume it for the first period, was a full 2-year period. Now, looking back, I do think that marijuana is one of the least harmful hedonistic drugs that one can consume, although I do not think that hedonism and hedonistic drug use is useful, actually, generally. But it is one of the least dangerous ones, certainly much less dangerous than alcohol. I think that had I approached it with a level of respect, considering it a serious drug and using it sparingly, it would have had a different effect on me. But unfortunately, I approached it with the idea that it was entirely harmless, and I really could smoke weed all day and be completely functional and a valuable member of society and fully participating in society, which is absolutely not true. So what happened when I consumed marijuana all day? What happened to my personality in my life? Well, let me take you through a checklist. The first thing that it did was, once I became habituated to marijuana use, if I spent even a single day entirely sober, I would get hyperstimulated, because the marijuana seems to indirectly manage the GABAergic system, and your body adapts to it. When you take it out, your GABAergic system is less inhibitory, and excitatory signaling like dopamine and glutamate rise. So I would be somewhat slightly manic on the days that I didn't use it. Second, that initial effect on my personality, which I enjoyed, of making me more empathetic and made me feel more compassionate toward other people, ended up overwhelming me. Over a period of time, I lost all my selfishness, and I started to honestly become a pushover to other people. The idea of if you think of a stoner is a pushover. Think of how they act. They're very thoughtful of other people. People push them around. They have no personality. That's really what happened. This loss of the ego was so tremendous that I was not really functional. Also, I lost all ability to direct long-term work. If you're smoking from the morning to the night, you will not be able to direct yourself for long-term ambitious work because your dopamine system will be completely dysregulated and be really dependent on your use of marijuana. I also lost my ability to think critically, analytically, from the top down. I used to have extremely precise thinking. It was very precise and I had a very strong short-term memory, such that I could, when I used to speak in paragraph form, and I used to speak, very comprehensively, conceptually, and I would think about things from the top down. When I used marijuana, I lost this ability acutely within a few months, and I never entirely regained it. A level of brain damage occurred just from the marijuana, where my thinking never completely returned to that level of precision and my short-term memory never entirely recovered. And by the way, if you watch my video of marijuana's effects on the brain, you will notice that the most pronounced long-term effects are death to hippocampal cells. The hippocampus is your source of memory. So there is a neurotoxic effect of cannabis, and it seems to be, although over time people seem to recover, I didn't feel an entire recovery from that aspect. I also, and this is embarrassing to say, when I used to consume marijuana all day and smoke it, I became hypogonadal. Now, there are reports in the literature of people developing, for example, gynecomastia and stuff like that. I didn't develop that, but I did become hypogonadal. I lost my sex drive almost entirely. And I also eventually lost hunger and became skinny, sort of like the way you see Wiz Khalifa and Snoop Dogg, these kind of people. I became skinny like them, wasn't very hungry, interestingly, over time. And two last things. I also developed extreme anxiety over time. See, initially, the marijuana would entirely abate my fears and concerns, and I was able to take control of my feelings. Over time, I lost control of it, such that even when I was actually consuming marijuana, I was still anxious. And over a long period of time, over 2 years, this anxiety became an actual disorder, developed almost entirely from my use of marijuana. Eventually, of course, many other things contributed to it, but initially, really, my anxiety came out when I used marijuana for an extended time period. Finally, because of my choice of marijuana strains, I imagine that had I been living, for example, in California when I used to do this, in California, the Kush strains are way more popular. These strains have some different kind of cannabinoids. I'm not sure exactly which ones they are, but certain cannabinoids seem to inhibit some of the psychedelic effects of the THC. Or maybe another cannabinoid, to be honest. It might not even just be THC. But in my case, I was living in Europe. And Europe don't have the kind of Kush varieties that California has for some reason. They do have hazes, which actually come from California, but interestingly, were way better developed in Europe. So for example, right now, by the way, I live in California. If I go to a weed shop right now, I cannot find hazes or sativas that are as powerful as I could in Amsterdam, like the Amnesia haze. But because of my choice of the strains that were in Europe, I was using strains that were highly psychedelic. And I did enter moments that could have put other people into, psychosis, really. I entered into moments where I could feel, my perception of reality is a little bit distorted, but thankfully my brain was quite robust, just luckily. Even though I have in my family mental illness, my brain was robust and I never ended up in a psychotic state. While I have other friends who, of course, I've mentioned before on the channel, ended up with mental illness because of marijuana use. But nonetheless, I ended up in those situations and they contributed tremendously to my anxiety. Now, some caveats before the pro-marijuana crowd attack me. First of all, I didn't mention the benefits that I got from marijuana. There were some benefits that I got from it that were long-lasting. They're mainly in the way I perceive the world, and I can't really get rid of them. I'm not sure if they're benefits or not. So there's something positive there. Second, again, my choice of strain really affected how much the marijuana affected me. If I was using, as I said, indicas or hybrids like Kushes, it would have been less severe. And third, keep in mind that these extreme results happen only when you consume marijuana from waking to nighttime, never take a break, and consume huge amounts. Most people can't even do this just because of the price of the marijuana. It's almost impossible for people to do it because it's very costly. So not many people ended up in this situation. But I'm talking about people who smoke marijuana like Snoop Dogg or Wiz Khalifa claim they do. Like, you always have a joint. Like, for example, I used to wake up and I would have my joints rolled for the day. There would be 20 joints in a pack of cigarettes. So I would walk around London. I always had joints. I had a pack of cigarettes and a pack of joints. That's the kind of smoking I'm talking about. I'm not talking about somebody who smokes once a day before bed. That will have tremendously different impacts on your psychology. But for those that did what I did, I want to offer you some tips that are specific to marijuana users in case you want to quit. This is not advice for quitting all drugs. There is advice, because of my family history with addiction, my own history with addiction, there's a lot of advice that I feel like I could give on the channel for people who are addicts who are trying to recover. Also because I have, I think, unique views on addiction and recovery. But I'll do those in future videos. I hope this could be a long-running theme of my channel, talking about addiction and recovery from it, which is an important subject, I think, for people in the modern age. But this video is not going to be about addiction in general. There's a lot of principles in general that you could use, and this video would run for hours and hours and hours. Instead, I want to offer specific advice that's unique to marijuana use. Because unique advice, for example, for cocaine abusers would be different than marijuana abusers. Because the results of the drug on the brain are slightly different. So I'm going to give you some unique advice specific to marijuana here and have it somewhat general so there are principles you can follow. Now, before we do, let's first review the major effects of cannabis on the mind. For those that haven't watched my video of how marijuana affects the brain, please watch that video. But if you have, you'll remember that number one, all hedonistic drugs work around dopamine. When you take dopamine into your own control, you dysregulate dopamine. Dopamine is a highly conserved hormone in the body. Your body recognizes when you transmit too much dopamine or there's too much dopaminergic signaling in general, and it either downregulates receptors or downregulates enzymes that synthesize dopamine or something like that. So basically, your body because dopamine, by the way, is neurotoxic. It's an excitatory hormone and it's so important for our overall well-being, it must be conserved. So when you use a hedonistic drug, you dysregulate dopamine. That's a given. But marijuana does something in particular, second to that. It dysregulates the GABAergic system. That's why I remember there's a comedian called Cat Williams. He has a joke that if you were smoking marijuana, the first time you smoke marijuana or something like that, he says, if your house was burning, you wouldn't care. You'd just sit outside or something like that. That's what I remember about the joke. That's somewhat true for the people that initially begin it. That comes from extreme overabundance of inhibitory signaling that gives you not a care in the world. But again, GABA, like dopamine, is highly conserved. So your body recognizes you have this high inhibitory component coming from your use of the drug. So it reduces inhibitory signaling in the brain. Most likely GABA, but probably other neurotransmitters also are reduced. So when you stop marijuana, the opposite happens. You're overexcitable. And the third thing, which I mentioned, is the toxicity to the hippocampus. That's the memory center of the brain. Marijuana is indeed, when smoking, neurotoxic. There is no question about that. It kills neurons, particularly in the hippocampus. It's particularly notorious for that. So when you've been abusing marijuana for a few years, you have not only the whole issue of addiction, but you have specific issues in terms of your brain. You have dopamine dysregulated, GABA dysregulated, and the death of neurons in your memory center of the brain. What happens when you quit marijuana? Well, the next day you have more energy than you would normally have. And it's sort of dysregulated energy. You could have even the feeling of anhedonia, but still overexcitability. So it's not like you're feeling euphoria, usually. Some people might, if they have dopamine issues. But usually you'll find an overexcitability. The feeling will be of adrenaline, and just your brain is also overexcitable. That's the glutamate, which could cause some neurotoxicity, by the way. So you may have brain fog, hyperactivity, and you'll have difficulty that day sleeping. And for a while, depending on how much you've used marijuana, you may have difficulty sleeping for months or a couple of months or so. So you have difficulty sleeping, you'll be overly excitable, and you'll obviously have difficulty adapting to the situation because your brain now is quite rigid. You see, when you are consuming marijuana, you cause an increase in neurotransmitter signaling that causes some plasticity in the brain, flexibility. But when you quit it, you have a reduced neurotransmitter signaling, and usually your brain, there's a personal belief of mine, your brain sort of gets stuck on the way it was functioning before. And finally, you also have this issue of you were used to doing a habit all day. As I mentioned many times on the channel, if smokers go blind, they usually quit smoking. It's because they can't see the habit. Even though everybody says nicotine is so addictive, it really isn't. I use nicotine daily and I can stop any day because I don't smoke. I use a nicotine pouch. So the issue with using the marijuana also is that you have this habit, whether it's particularly bad if you're a smoker, the least bad if you're eating it, but if you do it multiple times a day, you develop this habit that's associated with dopamine in the brain. So it can be easier to quit it if you can replace that habit in some way for the short term. So here are 4 tips I can offer you specific to marijuana. The first is, when you get off marijuana, find a way to sleep. Make sure that you sleep well. Whether you're manic in the morning or not, make sure you sleep well for a few hours every night. This will reduce the mania and ensure that you have something to look forward to at the end of the night, some kind of relaxation, which you expect always. So I'll offer you an example on that of what you could use in a second. The second thing you have to do, or not have to do, but you should consider doing under a doctor's supervision, and you can go to a doctor and specifically mention that you're withdrawing from marijuana and you're overly excitable, you feel a little bit manic. What you need, secondly, is something to cause inhibition in the nervous system, to reduce this period of anxiety and potentially mania for about, it usually lasts like 3 months or so if you're a long-term smoker, but it could last longer than that. It could last 6 months, so on. So something that slows the system down, okay? Something that slows the system down that's sustainable. No, so not benzos. Benzos are not sustainable. You can't take Valium. Valium will not work in 3 months and will leave you with a GABAergic deficit worse than marijuana did. Maybe worse, depending on the dose you use, of course. Marijuana is quite potent also. But you need something sustainable. I'll offer a suggestion later. Third thing is, and this isn't entirely necessary or specific to marijuana, but you have this neurotoxicity of the hippocampus, and you now have a rigid brain. If you could increase brain plasticity a little bit, you'll reduce anxiety, reduce depressive symptoms, but also, I believe, allow your brain potentially to remodel as you're adapting to your sober life. And fourth, is to find something that can replace that dopamine releasing habit that you were doing all day. If you are smoking marijuana, something that can replace that hits your dopamine a little bit, that is less harmful. So what could these things be? Well, there's many options, but using these 4 principles, let me give you an example. So one thing you could do is, for example, go to a doctor and ask for a prescription for quietapine, which is also called Seroquel. Seroquel is an antipsychotic, which actually offers quite a bit of benefit here because of the mania that comes following quitting heavy marijuana use. But beyond that, I'm talking about a very low dose of Seroquel, below the therapeutic dose, something between 25 milligrams and 100 milligrams taken about half an hour before sleeping. This will ensure that you sleep for 6 to 8 hours deeply. In fact, you've not been having REM sleep anyway since you were using marijuana. You probably won't have much REM sleep with the Seroquel, but you might even have more REM sleep than you did with the marijuana. You'll have better sleep than you did at the tail end of your marijuana abuse period. You could do this, say, for example, for 3 weeks or a month and taper the dose down as you quit it. Or you could do it longer if you feel the need. I mean, it's not so harmful, really. You could do it for 2 months or 3 months. I still sometimes use Seroquel, maybe once a month, because I often film with Boston at night, and sometimes I film with him at night and I can't sleep afterwards. So sometimes I'll take 25 milligrams Seroquel, once every few weeks if I end up in that situation. It's quite, in my opinion, one of the most innocuous sleeping medications. So that's one thing. You could take Seroquel for, say, 3 weeks and titrate down. The second thing, how do you slow your system down? Well, you could use an SSRI, but if you were to do so, the effects would take about, honestly, 6 months really to work. And you'd have to probably start it before you quit marijuana. And that is an option, but that could cause sexual dysfunction. A lot of people are concerned about that. Instead, you could use an anti-epileptic medication that sustainably increases GABA concentrations in the brain. So something like, for example, sodium valproate, aka Depakote. Depakote is the long-release version of valproic acid, sodium valproate. Now, I should make a video on this subject eventually, on just that drug. But the drug, if you titrate very slowly, that's the concern. Never begin at more than 250 milligrams twice a day. Meaning you wake up 250 and 12 hours later 250 milligrams of the extended release Depakote version. Start always under doctor supervision, always with the lowest dose possible, 250, and only raise the dose when you notice 0 effects, which means 0 gastrointestinal effects, 0 acid reflux, and nothing else that's annoying you. So maybe a week or 2 go by, and then you raise by 250 each time. So to 500 milligrams upon rising, 500 milligrams 12 hours later, then you can go to 750, then to 1,000. I think 1,000 twice a day is the perfect probably dose to overwhelm that decrease of inhibitory signaling after you quit marijuana. And by the way, clearskypharmacy.biz carries the extended release version of this drug. And this drug is quite sustainable. What it does is cause increase of GABA concentration in the brain without directly modulating the GABA A receptors, like benzos, or the GABA B receptors, like phenibut and baclofen. So it doesn't directly modulate receptors, which makes it much more sustainable. You can slowly titrate the dose up, stay at that dose for, say, 3 to 6 months, and then titrate the dose down, thereby reducing the peak anxiety periods of quitting the marijuana. Those periods, I believe, really, if you do not control them, can leave a permanent imprint on your brain and your soul because of the level of anxiety. Now, by the way, The inhibitory signaling, I mentioned valproate. There could be many more things. You could combine valproate with an SSRI. You could combine valproate with a beta blocker. You could use an NMD antagonist like memantine to reduce neurotoxicity from the excess glutamate. There are many things you could do, but this is just a suggestion. For example, valproate under doctor's supervision. And how could you increase the plasticity of your brain? Well, if you're not using an SSRI or something else, well, you could, when you quit marijuana, do, for example, a 5-day period of, say, 10 milliliters a day of cerebrolysin injected intramuscularly. By the way, I recently made a video on cerebrolysin. You could do like 5 days of 10 milliliters, and then say, for example, 3 days a week, you could do 5 milliliters thereafter and continue it for, say, 5 months or so. So getting through that period. This will have a significant effect. It's not just an acute effect from the initial injection. You'll notice that the cerebrolysin gets more powerful as you do it more days in a row. You could, for example, start with 10 days a row of 10 milliliters and then go to 3 times a week of 5 or 10 or something like that. The more you do, the more plasticity you'll have and the less anxiety you'll have acutely. And the point of the cerebrolysin, of course, is to give your brain the flexibility to adapt to the new sober life that you're going to be living. And a fourth example of this program is to replace the dopamine habit that you were using all day, especially if you were smoking marijuana. I've actually encountered some people, by the way, that were consuming huge amounts of marijuana, but were drinking it, like marijuana oils, or eating it. This is sort of different, I suppose. But for the people that smoked it or vaped marijuana, you have a habit that you're used to. So if you smoke cigarettes and you quit marijuana, you'll still have a habit that gives you some dopamine signaling throughout the day. But what if you don't smoke cigarettes? You don't have any habit. Here, I would, with caution, suggest you to look into my podcast with Chad about snus and about nicotine pouches. The reason why I refer you to the podcast is because I don't know much about nicotine pouches. I don't really like them. The nicotine pouches are sort of plant matter that are sprayed with nicotine, and the nicotine usually releases very suddenly, which I don't really like. On the other hand, snus, which is a Swedish version of oral tobacco that's not fermented, it's not like American oral tobacco, which is highly carcinogenic. The Swedish one, snus, is actually not associated with any cancer, especially not with oral cancer or lung cancer. It may be associated with pancreatic cancer, but pancreatic cancer is something really modulated by adrenaline levels. And since personally I block adrenaline for much of the day, I'm not too concerned about the overall effect of snus hyping my adrenaline system up. But anyway, if you choose either snus or nicotine pouches, what you can do is you can have a habit of putting something in your mouth and getting a slight burst of dopamine from the nicotinic cholinergic receptors, and maybe it'll be something useful to get you through that habit period. One word of caution though, if you are using cerebrolysin at the doses that I mentioned, you will not feel the dopamine experience from the nicotine. Unfortunately, this is one of the side effects of cerebrolysin. Just like ibogaine, it will totally inhibit, at high enough dose, totally inhibit the feelings of using nicotine. You won't get any dopamine rush. You won't feel the potency of it, and so on. So there's a guideline on how to quit marijuana from my personal experience. Number 1, make sure you sleep. Number 2, increase inhibitory signaling under the guidance of a psychiatrist. Number 3, increase brain plasticity. And number 4, find another habit that you can do throughout the day. And by the way, if you guys were using marijuana the way I was, which means basically to try to repair the way you see the world. You didn't like your natural state of the way your brain feels. You didn't fall into it by accident. It's not just a habit that you happen to do. I don't know why you would fall into it by accident, but rather you preferred at some point the way you looked at the world through marijuana and tried to use it as a daily aid in your neuropsychology. If that's the case, the only way that you'll be able to quit long term without not enjoying your life is by finding a sustainable pharmacologic and lifestyle intervention to change the way your actual neurotransmitters in your brain function and the way your brain structurally functions. If you don't solve that, you'll always not like being sober. But anyway, this advice was about just how to get yourself out of that rut where you're addicted to marijuana. I hope it was helpful for you guys. Please let me know if you have any questions down below, and I'll try to answer them either in the comment section, or if they're a long question, I'll try to make another video. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me, and I'll see you next time.